Narrative empathy is differential. I begin my talk today with the following proposal. Narrative empathy is differential. That is to say, narrative empathy is defined not only by co-feeling with one or more characters in a story, usually the protagonist, but also by the withdrawal of empathy for and from others, such as antagonists, neutral background characters, and or persons or groups who are targets of blame within a story. Stories depend on conflict. Without conflict, there is no story. And readers assign praise or blame to characters and situations by following the author's roadmap or their own or some combination. Narrative empathy triangulates through conflict. Readers feel empathy for a character who faces adversity, whether in the form of a person or group or a situation. The flip side of that empathy might be judgment, blame, or detachment from someone or something associated with the problem. Potentially, readers could deem all parties in a story equally innocent and or equally blameworthy, in which case the coin has landed on its edge. That is not the usual outcome, though. Scapegoats are interesting figures to consider in relation to narrative empathy because they arouse strong emotions, whether positive or negative. Think of them as the lightning rod in a story, where its most powerful charge is likely to land. Scapegoats are virtually universal in culture, while in literature, they're a standard device for structuring conflict and provoking readers' empathy. Scapegoats are powerful figures because they evoke one of our deepest fears, social death, or being in some way cut off from the herd. They can also evoke the human need to blame someone else for misfortune or adversity. They can evoke our protective feelings toward the innocent and vulnerable. Scapegoats can be reviled or cherished, eliciting hatred, love, ambivalence, or many other feelings and emotions, depending on how the story is told. Next, I will review some of the anthropological history of scapegoats, their preeminent place in world religions, and theorizations of the phenomenon by Emile Durkheim, René Girard, and others. In the second half of my talk, I will analyze Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novella, Crónica de una muerte anunciada, Chronicle of a Death Foretold, in order to show how a skillful writer creates an empathy puzzle around the ambiguous role of the scapegoat. A history of the scapegoat ritual. The English word scapegoat was coined by William Tyndale for his 1530 translation of the Pentateuch. Leviticus 16 describes a selection of 2 goats for the Mosaic ritual of the Day of Atonement. One of those goats is intended for sacrifice, while the other is sent alive into the wilderness, with the sins of the people having been symbolically laid upon it. Scapegoat was Tyndale's non-literal rendering of the Hebrew word Azazel. Tyndale translates verse 10 as, "But the goat on which the lot fell to scape, he shall be set alive before the Lord to reconcile with, and let him go free into the wilderness." The goat for Azazel, possibly the degraded form of a Babylonian deity, was handed over to a man, brought to an isolated region, and then let go. Religious historian Jan Bremer notes that there were analogs to the Hebrew ritual among the Greeks, Romans, and Hittites, as well as in India and Tibet. Bremer studied Greek sources describing the ritual, or sacrifice of humans, during times of drought, famine, plague, war, or purification rites. The ritual seems to have been performed during normal times as well, during the Thargelia, an Ionian summer harvest festival. Slaves and people of lowly origin, ugly people, criminals, youths, women, foreigners, and even kings could be chosen as a pharmakos. That's one of the Greek words for scapegoat. The common element linking these groups was that they were on the margins of their society. The sacrifice of kings and aristocratic figures seems to have been a feature of myth and legend, however, and not an actual practice. There's a lot of debate about whether any of the pharmakoi were ever killed, as described in myths, or just exiled. Sociologist Stepan Mestrovich argues that the scapegoat concept has its basis in all religions, whether ancient or contemporary. In Christianity, for example, Jesus is the scapegoat, or rather the sacrificial lamb who through his crucifixion and death atones for the sins of the world. When one starts to look for scapegoats, one finds them everywhere, at the center of cultures, myths, religions, and stories. Modern theorizations. In 1912, the sociologist Emile Durkheim published in French The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. There he described ancient piacular rites, which express the solidarity of a community in the face of a crisis. The word derives from the Latin piaculum, meaning a victim, sacrifice, punishment, atonement, crime, or sin. The death of a member of the community was for Durkheim inevitably such a crisis. Durkheim speculated on why in antiquity the living needed to appease the dead through rituals that required real or symbolic pain on the part of survivors. His answer was that such rites drew the community together. Mestrovich states, "There's no such thing as a natural death. All death is unnatural interruption of the flow of life and is attributed to the evil of other persons, spirits, entities, or even material objects." According to Mestrovich, responsibility is like a lightning strike that will discharge pain and suffering onto the most expedient object. Unquote. Someone or something is always going to take the blame. The French critic René Girard offered his own theory of the scapegoat that builds on Durkheim's. In his 1982 book, The Scapegoat, Girard explored the phenomenon of collective persecutions, such as that of European Jews during the Black Death, the witch hunts of early modernity, or the political terrors of the French Revolution. In extreme circumstances, quote, this is Girard, institutional collapse obliterates or telescopes hierarchical and functional differences so that everything has the same monotonous and monstrous aspect, unquote. This loss of difference precipitates a mimetic crisis, interpersonal and intergroup rivalries that lead to extreme violence. Such a crisis can be temporarily resolved when blame coalesces around a scapegoat, uniting everyone else against the victim or victims. Girard called this process the scapegoat mechanism, by which order is temporarily restored in the large group by a collective dehumanizing act of violence, or at least that's the fantasy. The scapegoating mechanism in literature. Narrative point of view plays a huge role in influencing how or whether a reader will perceive a scapegoat in the story. A narrator hostile to a scapegoated person or group may invite readers to participate vicariously in their scapegoating without reflecting on why somebody's getting blamed. Girard's example is the 14th century text, Judgment of the King of Navarre by Guillaume de Machaut, who blamed the Jews of his community for the Black Death. Then there are other narratives that invite only partial empathy for their scapegoats. Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, for example, relies on religious and ethnic stereotypes to scapegoat Shylock. The difference is that Shylock is granted a degree of humanity, and he invites some empathy from the audience, even though he is ultimately scapegoated by the other characters. Other types of narrative may encourage readers' empathy for scapegoats because of their blamelessness, their vulnerability, or their sacrifice. The locus classicus is the martyrdom of Socrates. Plato ensures that the reader will empathize with Socrates, who chooses actual death over the social death of exile by drinking hemlock. He's a victim, but not a passive one, and he becomes the hero of the 4 dialogues describing his condemnation and death. In the remainder of my talk, I will focus on yet another kind of scapegoat narrative, one that contains an empathy puzzle. Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 1981 novel, Crónica de una muerte anunciada, Chronicle of a Death Foretold, asks readers to make a judgment about the guilt or innocence of a scapegoated character. It is a difficult, violent, and bizarre story. It's also a brilliant story because it demands extensive reflection from the reader about how group-level violence and scapegoating can unfold. We learn from the opening line of the story that the central character is about to die. Quote, "On the day they were going to kill him, Santiago Nassar got up at 5:30 in the morning to wait for the boat the bishop was coming on." Unquote. We soon learn that on the previous evening, there was a wedding in the town with a catastrophic outcome. Quote, "Angela Vicario, the beautiful girl who'd gotten married the day before, had been returned to the house of her parents because her husband had discovered that she wasn't a virgin." Unquote. Angela, brutally beaten by her mother, named Santiago Nassar as the person who took her virginity. Her twin brothers, Pedro and Pablo, still drunk from the night before, decide to murder Santiago in an honor killing. The narrator, a fictionalized version of Garcia Marquez himself, goes back to the unnamed town 27 years after the crime to see what he can uncover about it. He interviews the residents for information about the killing. He states, quote, "There had never been a death more foretold. After their sister revealed the name to them, the Vicario twins went to the bin in the pigsty where they kept the sacrificial tools and picked out the two best knives. The phrase útiles de sacrificio, which can mean slaughtering tools or sacrificial tools, calls to mind ancient rituals of scapegoating, as critics have noted. Santiago Nassar will be the sacrifice, but not just to the honor of the Vicario family and the bridegroom, whose name is Bayardo San Roman. A large number of people in this unnamed town, a version of Garcia Marquez's hometown in Colombia, know of the intended killing before it happens, but they don't stop it. The twins tell everyone they meet of their plan to kill Santiago. Many don't believe the twins will follow through. Others think that the murder is justified, or they can't stand Santiago to begin with. Still others think it's not their job to interfere. Certain interventions fail to prevent the murder. For example, the mayor takes away the knives from the drunken twins, who then procure two more knives. Someone puts a note under the door of Santiago's house, but Santiago never gets the message. Santiago's friend, Cristo Bedoya, tries desperately to find him before it's too late, but he can't. Santiago's future father-in-law, Nahir Miguel, directly tells Santiago to either stay inside their house or take a gun with him. Confused and distressed, Santiago runs out of his fiancée's house straight towards his killers, who stab him 20 times at Santiago's own locked front door and run away. At the close of the book, Santiago's death, anticipated on every page before the last, is described in grisly detail. And I quote, "Desperate, Pablo Vicario gave him a horizontal slash on the stomach, and all his intestines exploded out. Pedro Vicario was about to do the same, but his wrist twisted with horror, and he gave him a wild cut on his thigh. Santiago Nassar was still for an instant, leaning against the door, until he saw his own viscera in the sunlight, clean and blue, and he fell on his knees." Unquote. The fact that Santiago is butchered like an animal elicits the reader's empathy, sympathy, and emotional distress. He is both humanized and dehumanized in the moments before his death. The fact that almost the whole town is to some degree complicit in not stopping the murder raises questions about the meaning of the killing. There is passive aggression towards Santiago at the level of the community, and the question is why. The narrator explains, quote, "For the majority of people, there was only one victim, Bayardo San Roman. They took it for granted that the other actors in the tragedy had been fulfilling with dignity, and even with a certain grandeur, They're part of the destiny that life assigned to them. Santiago Nassar had expiated the insult. The brothers Vicario had proved their status as men, and the seduced sister was in possession of her honor once more." Unquote. After waiting 3 years in prison for their trial, the brothers are acquitted of the crime because the court accepts the excuses presented. The narrator, however, casts doubt on this verdict. When Santiago learns from his father-in-law that the brothers were after him, quote, his reaction was not one of panic, as has so often been said, but rather the bewilderment of innocence, unquote. Nothing in his behavior before his murder suggests guilt. Later on, many theories circulate. Was Angela protecting her real lover from violence by naming someone rich, seemingly beyond the reach of her brothers? The narrator asks his cousin Angela point blank, "Don't beat it to death, cousin." Fue él. He was the one. The narrator, like the townspeople, shows little sympathy for Angela, who's compelled to leave town with her family. Her fate is social death, and the stigma of lost honor hangs over her, as well as the murder. In a completely improbable ending, Vallardo San Roman shows up at her door after 17 years to take her back. Whether they live happily ever after, we do not know. I've called this novella an empathy puzzle. Clearly, it's a scapegoat narrative, and Santiago Nassar is the communal sacrifice. He may or may not have been guilty of what he was accused of. As Angela Haddad notes, quote, no definitive evidence points to Santiago's culpability. The readers are repeatedly confronted with his otherness, unquote. As in the ancient Greek rituals of scapegoating, Santiago is positioned on the periphery of his community. He's an Arab, the son of an immigrant, a foreigner. And even though he's Catholic, prosperous, and seemingly accepted by his community, one wonders what's going on. His outsider position and his wealth raise another question of motive. Are his fellow citizens jealous of his beauty, his riches, his position? Is that why so many fail to act when there's a chance of saving him? The narrative raises a still larger question. Why does anyone ever get scapegoated? We see the lightning flash of blame strike Santiago and the town's complicity. In Girardian fashion, Garcia Marquez shows us the intricate workings of the scapegoat mechanism. Crónica de una muerte anunciada is a deeply ambiguous story that leaves readers defiled by the violence in which we have vicariously participated. Like the townspeople, we are implicated by our own attempts to assess guilt and blame, as if that would justify Santiago's killing. Garcia Marquez is clear. Scapegoating is not the solution to anybody's problem. I've argued today that scapegoating is an utterly common, yet highly destructive form of human behavior. It's important to become aware of it, more aware of it, even though we all know exactly what it is. In stories, though, scapegoating is a standard device that writers may use to assign praise or blame in order to help readers navigate the conflicts of the narrative. Readers may follow the clues of the author or make their own determinations about which characters on whom to bestow their empathy. Scapegoats, however we may feel about them, build up the emotional charge in the stories where they appear and intensify empathy wherever it may land. Thank you.